everyone, and welcome to another episode of Overeducated, Underloved Millennials. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host Adam. Hi, Adam. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. And this episode, we've decided to talk about what we call the odds and sods, which is a quote taken from this house, I believe, a play that toured the UK. Regarding UK politics, and we're going to be talking about the Lib Dems, the SNP, Reform UK, the Green Party, and Plaid Cymru, all of which are smaller parties in the United Kingdom. Obviously, we focused a lot on the larger parties, but obviously everybody's been having a conference recently and setting out their sights for the UK and where they want to push the policy. So we thought it'd be really good to have a sort of roundup on who's saying what. Adam.
Yeah, so first of all, if you've not seen this house, please go and see it. Well, or try and find it. I'm sure you can find it online. It is a brilliant play. It's about it's a bit bizarre because it focuses on particularly on the Whip Office during the Wilson and Callaghan governments. So that period between 1974 and 1979, when Labour had a minority government.
Tumultuous time.
Yeah, exactly. A very. I mean, it's brilliant in that sense because it does work as both a comedy and also quite a serious political drama. And there was this one reference, obviously being a minority government, where they needed to win the support of the odds and sods. So those other sort of smaller parties that they needed to get, their budgets, their policies over the line, as it were. So yeah, so I guess we wanted to, in that sort of nature, we wanted to talk about, I guess, the 5 parties that are currently sort of aren't the big 2, but are currently active enough and get enough support in polls where they either have seats already in Parliament or could potentially maybe win a couple of seats in Parliament the next election. And yeah, see where they see how they're doing, see what they could, possibly bring to British politics as a whole. So, unsurprisingly, given my political leanings, we're going to start with the Liberal Democrats, and I guess they are unique in this group as they're the only political party who haven't had a conference this autumn, and that's been because their conference was supposed to be the weekend just after Queen Elizabeth II died. So they rightfully, in my opinion, obviously didn't hold the conference then. I would be slightly critical of Ed Davey on this. I would say that similarly to how the TUC postponed their conference rather than cancelling it, I think it would have made a lot of sense for the Lib Dems to have postponed it and maybe sort of done it possibly later in October, maybe early November, because it does seem like the Tories have offered us, as the Liberal Democrats, a massive open goal, particularly in the south of England. And I feel like the conference could have really been a chance to, put that away, as it were, and really get some support. But it is what it is, and we have to we have to continue going on. So, Katie, I would say, what are your views? Do you think the Lib Dems should have had a conference, or do you think they did the right thing?
I think they should have had a conference. I think they were right to cancel it when they did, but I think they should have reorganised the conference and rescheduled it, simply due to the fact of, as you've said, the Tories are kind of giving everybody an open goal at the moment. And really, what we're seeing in polls at the moment is the Liberal Democrat vote isn't holding up overly well. Like the Labour vote seems to be going up, but the Liberal Democrat vote is kind of staying still, or is even in some polls decreasing. So I think it would have been a really good opportunity for the Liberal Democrats to lay out their agenda separate from their previous agenda, which was obviously stop Brexit, etc. They need to now move away and produce a vision for the United Kingdom. Obviously it harkens back to Nick Clegg's days in 2010, the time where pretty much everybody that I know considered voting Liberal Democrat or maybe voted Liberal Democrat. So, it would give them a chance to really sort of outline where they want to put the country. And I feel like they've really missed the bar on this one, especially because it's really hard for them to get airtime, the same as Labour do, because obviously their seat share of Parliament just isn't there.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that 100%. I think just to try and defend my party a little bit. So they've been about 8 to 10% in the polls for about a couple of months now. I think they maybe were slightly higher, I think, in the summer when there was the Johnson chaos kind of going on. But I think really it's been sort of I don't think I've ever seen us above 12% in the last sort of year or so. So it's definitely, I would say, it's been a steady sort of level of support. I think, though, obviously there have been in the sort of past, well, since the new parliament, there have been some big successes in by-elections. So Cheshire and Amershire, North Shropshire and Tiverton and Horton were these 3 big victories in by-elections. I would obviously add the caveat to that the Lib Dems are historically, and the Liberals and SDP sort of predecessors were historically always very good at winning by-elections. However, I think these 3 seats in particular, given just how big the Tory majorities were, it did feel like a significant moment. And I think another point I would raise, what we see because of, our wonderful electoral system, if you target your 8 to 10% in the right places, you can actually win a fair few seats. And I think if I was Ed Davey, if I was, in the centre office trying to put together an electoral strategy for the party, I would go back to the sort of Paddy Ashdown approach. I would essentially, what I would do is I would pick maybe 5 to 10 seats in Scotland, then about 20 to 30 in the south of England. So, your Richmonds, your Eastleys, your Wimbledons, that sort of areas.
Ones that would never vote Labour, but could be persuaded to vote
exactly,
Liberal.
Exactly. 100%. And you just throw the kitchen sink at them. And I think, if I'm being blunt, if we could win 25 to 30 seats at the next general election, I think that would be a huge success. I think the problem, again, I think the problem with lots of Liberal Democrats is, obviously not me because I'm a bit younger, but sort of people of my sort of granddad's age and maybe a bit younger remember the days of Charles Kennedy and Paddy Ashdown when they were, smashing 50 plus seats, and it was really, were dominating at local, well, not dominating,
days.
Having big successes in local elections. They were seen as the local party, the real sort of, alternative party. And I think we need to, I think as a party, we need to be a bit more realistic and understand we are now in a, partly because of our own mistakes in government. We have to be honest about that. We have to rebuild. And yeah, I think, that would be, I think, a logical strategy for the party. I don't know if you agree.
I do agree with that. And I think that what those seats tell us is it tells us that the Liberal Democrat Party had the way that they handled Brexit needed to be very, very, specific and very wise, because what we didn't want them to turn into was a one-issue party, right? We didn't want them to turn into the party that was solely about opposing Brexit and about, solely about European movement and membership. So I think that what those by-elections have shown us is that the Liberal Democrats do actually have potential, because those seats, I think all of them, were Brexit voting seats. So an anti-Brexit party won those seats. So it shows that the narrative has moved on, and it shows that the Liberal Democrats have overcome that narrative. And it's exactly what I said. I think it's just their vote has been steady, and I think they have potential down south where they can offer a vision that is more socially liberal, but more economically conservative than Labour, that would enable them to reach out to those southern seats that Labour just would not have a chance with. And I'm obviously of the opinion, exactly as you said, I think it's an age thing. I would rather have a progressive coalition in government if that's what we needed to do, if it was representative of the British people, than not. So I do want the Liberal Democrats to take seats that Labour can't take. And so I do think that there is some benefit in the focused methods of Paddy Ashdown, because the party is smaller, because the resources are fewer. You need to maximise your outcome. And the only way that you can do that is focusing in areas where I think you can win. And I think those areas are where Labour just hasn't got a blinking chance, but where you can really set out a vision for being better than whatever it is that Liz Truss is doing right now, which is like nothing, right? She's literally just hiding now, isn't she? So, now's the time.
Yeah, and one more thing, Ed Davey, please do not say you're going to be Britain's next Prime Minister. Please don't say you're going to be Britain, because that's for goodness sake, yeah.
I remember so vividly the day that election video came out, and I sent it to my friend who is a Lib Dem organiser, and I was like, "You've just lost. You've literally just lost."
Yeah, I mean,
it's like,
yeah.
No, I know.
I remember, yeah, when Jo Swinson got elected, I did sort of. One of my fears was she would actually, I did say to my granddad, actually, when we watched the result come in, I said, I'm really worried she's going to lose her seat in the next election because the SNP are going to put a huge target on her back. And they did. And that's sadly what happened. But anyway, enough about,
that video, and that's it.
I mean, yeah, oh gosh, yeah, I'm going to be Britain's. I mean, it was the leaflet as well. That was the worst part. She sent the leaflet out with the, Britain's next pride. It was just like, oh, for goodness sake, please.
And it was a weird running montage as well. That I like I said, it's one of the only electoral videos, to be fair, that I remember. But it was like the weird running montage with the let's get it was crazy.
But yeah, so it is interesting. I think another, because obviously we can't talk about the Lib Dem conference because there wasn't a conference. So I'm trying to sort of more talk about general issues related to the party in the future. So regarding sort of possible coalitions and thinking about possible coalitions, I can almost guarantee when we get to the next election, if the polls, I suspect the polls will tighten a bit. Sorry to say, I can't see Labour having a 30-point lead in 2 years' time.
I'd be sitting on like 50%.
Yeah, it's not, well, maybe it will, but I suspect the question will come to where, Davey, will be, would you go into coalition with, either the Labour Party or the Conservatives? So personally, I would be very happy, thinking from a personal political perspective, I'd be very happy for Davey to say, yes, we'd happily go into coalition with the Labour Party. That's fine. I would obviously be very sceptical of another coalition with the Conservatives, not just because we've been bitten once, but also I think it would just be now. I think particularly the Conservatives are just ideologically incompatible with Liberal Democrat policy. I think it's just
and
can't
now
work.
They're looking for a scapegoat.
Yeah, exactly. So that would just be, obviously that should be a no. It probably goes without saying, but I just want to really highlight that point. Yeah, but also I kind of understand why Ed Davey might be slightly cautious to say that during the election campaign, because if you're looking to appeal to, as I said, these sort of southern, maybe former Tory voters, I can understand why they might have some concerns about saying, yes, we'll, go into government with Labour. Because you can guarantee then the Tory response would be, look, if you vote Lib Dem, you get Labour in the back door. That would be the response. So I can see what I'm trying to say is I can see both points of view. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I can see both points of view. I can see why you wouldn't go into an election, because you're basically going into an election saying that you're not going to win. Which isn't good, which is why Labour can't do it, right? It's why we can't say, oh yeah, we're going to be part of a coalition, we're going to look at a coalition, which is why I think we came so hard down on the SNP one, because we need to go for majority, right? Like that's what you need to do. But I think that from a Labour perspective, I think that there's massive credit in the Liberal Democrats and Labour having an agreement to ensure that we both focus our resources on not fighting each other, on fighting the Conservatives. And I think that that's where we need to be. I think that for all of the stuff that Labour hold the Liberal Democrats responsible for when it comes to 2010, we have seen what the Conservatives can do in government without the Liberal Democrats there, So it's like worse. So Labour and the Liberal Democrats, have a history of working together as well. Let's not, forget that. In governments in the 70s, we've had Lib-Lab pacts where the Liberals and Labour have worked together to get really important legislation through. So I think one of the things that we need to focus on is that a lot of people in Britain see coalition as a weakness and see it as a failure. And actually, we've produced some of our strongest legislation under coalition governments. And so I think people need to get rid of that negative perspective and remember that in the 60s and the 70s, Labour was only able to pass all of the sweeping legislation that it was able to pass socially with the support of Liberal MPs, with the support of the odds and sods. So there's something that needs to be said for working together. So I think that it's a winning strategy for both of us, because there's some seats down south that we're never going to win. In Labour, we have this thing where it's like, if they didn't vote for us in 97, they're probably not going to vote for us. If there's a Tory that didn't vote for us in 97, they're a pretty strong Tory. So, and I think that that's what we need to look at. And I don't think it's going to be a Labour hammer that can crush that. It's definitely got to be a Liberal Democrat one.
I think also it just strategically it makes more sense, right? Because I think there's very few seats. I think maybe with the exception of Sheffield Hallam, and I think one seat in Cambridge South. I think they're the only two seats I can think of where there are no Labour, apart from those two. There's no Labour Lib Dem swing seats. So it makes sense strategically in terms of using your resource. It makes no sense for the two parties to attack each other. It doesn't make any sense at all.
We're at a time where resources are limited and things are getting tighter. As the economy is getting tighter, I don't know how the Liberal Democrat Party is funded, but the Labour Party is funded. We work off of the funding of our members. We don't accept huge donations, as much as the Conservatives do. So we're not reliant on business donations and business donors, etc., as much as other parties. So, as the economy gets worse, the purse strings tighten. So we both really need to focus our resources in a really effective way. And attacking each other is just stupid at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, the Lib Dems, we don't get that big union money that you do, So we solely rely on, we basically solely rely on, individuals, people, sort of, parliament members like me paying us sort of £12 a year, whatever it is. I get to pay as a student.
The money that
so we definitely we do not from the Lib Dems, we just don't have the money or the resources to waste time targeting the Labour Party. It makes no sense in my opinion. So onto the SNP and Scottish nationalism more generally, I guess we can talk about as well. So they've had their conference this week. And I guess the first thing to talk about is the controversy. I don't know if you saw this, the controversy around Nicola Sturgeon saying she detested the Tories. And I thought it was quite interesting. So she said this on the Laura Kuenssberg show, and it was a bit of I don't think she even really meant. It was a very flippant comment. I don't think she really meant much by it. It wasn't
sort of just.
It was just a sort of throwaway line. It was nothing comment. Really.
Well, yeah, and then, I didn't even pick it up.
I didn't really at all. And then Nadeem Zahawi, who, what's his role now? He's in the cabinet. What's his actual?
He's Lord. Isn't he the Duchy of Lancaster?
Yes, that's it. Yeah, so he's basically. I get the impression that role is basically just an extra person to support you in the cabinet. I've never actually understood.
They can wheel out on question time.
Exactly, a sort of almost like hype man for the party or so. I've never understood what that role is, but yeah. So Nadeem Zahawi really was critical of this comment. He said it was a dangerous comment. So I guess let's just start from that. Do you think it was a dangerous comment from Nicola Sturgeon?
I do not think it was a dangerous comment from Nicola Sturgeon. When I rewound it and saw it, to be honest with you, I've been very impressed with Nicola Sturgeon's performance for the entirety of conference. I think this was one of many strong performances that she's given. And I think that it's totally fine to say that you detest the Tories. Labour MPs have said much worse. I've got a poster on my wall that's a quote from Aneurin Bevan, which considers them lower than vermin. So I think that that's worse. And we said that in 1940. So I really don't think that it's that inflammatory. I think what is inflammatory is the language that the Conservatives are using to attack minorities such as trans people, etc. So I really don't think people in glass houses, Nadeem, should be throwing stones at this point, because there's only one party that's using cultural narratives to stoke up divisions in the United Kingdom and has consistently been doing it for 10 years, and that's the Tory party. So yeah, most people in Scotland do hate the Tories. So why are we shocked by that?
I mean, yeah, but first of all, that is a good point, right? It's the SNP, of course, they don't like the Tories. That's just a given. But I think here's the thing. So what I would say is, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. Given that Zahawi consistently supported Boris Johnson, defended Boris Johnson, the man who has used both homophobic and racial slurs in the past, the man who, when was directly in Parliament, asked the question of what do you think about women being abused and verbally abused, he dressed it off as humbug, didn't think of it as much of an issue. Given the sort of stuff that he has defended from Johnson in the past, I think it's very hypocritical. That being said, I would like to say I think it is important to note there's a difference between saying I detest the Tory ideology and I detest the Tories as a party. There's a difference between that, which I think I understand why you'd say that, and I agree with that to some extent. But I would be slightly more concerned if she said I detest Tories. I think, all Tories are evil, something like that. You know what I mean? If she said I detest Tories, then I'd understand. But I do think, so I think there is a crucial difference. You can obviously attack. I absolutely understand. You want to attack an ideology, attack policies. I think some of the Tory stuff that they've done is frankly evil in the last 5 years, and there's no other way to put it.
It is evil. There's no other word for it.
But I would say obviously there's a line between that and attacking. I wouldn't attack individuals. I think if you have a conservative mindset, that's you. That's who you are, right? You can't. I wouldn't hate someone for that, if that makes sense.
And this isn't. Let's be honest. This isn't inciting anything, right? So I think that there's a big difference here. And I think that, obviously you've got Joe Biden said it really, really importantly a few months ago. Words matter, right? Okay. And how you say things matters. Okay. When you're in a position of power and you're a public figure. Nicola Sturgeon, by saying that, didn't say, oh, I hate all Conservatives. We should go out and we should, do this and do that. No, there was not even an inkling. Like we said, it was a throwaway comment. It was not inciting anybody to hurt anybody. It was not inciting anybody to do anything to anybody. Whereas Liz Truss, during her leadership campaign, has said many things that were incendiary and insightful of hateful things. The comments, like I said, again, against trans people, further inciting people when at a time where, violence against trans people has gone up considerably. I mean, I'm not being funny. We haven't got record highs of people hurting Conservatives, have we? You know what I mean? It's not inciting anything. It's a comment. It's her saying their whole ideology, their whole thing that they put out there, don't like it. I think it's terrible, which fair play, because let's be honest, most people are so scared to actually go after parties anymore for fear of being told that they're inciting things. For goodness sake, how long were we saying about Keir? You should go after the Tories, go after them. She's just doing her job.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. So I just wanted to bring that up because obviously it was a big sort of
Yeah, it was
bizarrely a
huge.
big. It was big in the media. I mean, yeah, the media hyped it up so much. I think the BBC also the way they reported it in the headline was very misleading as well. But we won't get onto that.
Yeah.
I thought, yeah. Anyway, so let's talk about the actual issues. And obviously, it goes without saying, as it is the Scottish National Party, the primary issue of the day is now independence. Surprise, surprise, right? It's the SNP. Though interesting, I would point out, obviously, this issue has been it was paused for a couple of years due to COVID, which actually, understandably they took the view it's probably not good to talk about independence while there's a pandemic on. I think they quite sensibly took that view.
Probably a show of national
Yeah,
unity.
exactly.
Up the union, is it?
Exactly. So I think, but obviously now we are. Though I'm always slightly concerned to say about the pandemic because there are still lots of COVID cases, but we have moved on. I think as a country in sort of political terms. Clearly, that means independence is now back on the agenda. So the current policy of the SNP officially is that there will be an independence referendum on the 19th of October of 2023. So in just over a year's time. Wait, what's the date today? What's the date today? It's just over a year, isn't it?
It's literally just over a year, yeah, because it's
like
yeah.
I'm going to say it's like yeah, exactly. So yeah, just over a year. But so for those who haven't been paying attention, this relies on the SNP finding a legal route to hold a referendum. So in 2014, for those who don't know, was when Scotland previously had a referendum on independence, in which it voted 55 to 45 against independence. They got what was called so what happened was the SNP won a majority in the Scottish Parliament in 2011 to have on the policy of holding a referendum, and then the UK government, the coalition government at the time, agreed to hold this referendum. So they gave the Scottish government what's called a Section 30, which effectively gave the Scottish Parliament the right to hold an independence referendum. Now this time around, so the SNP is now arguing. The argument from the SNP is because primarily of Brexit, there has been a fundamental change of circumstances within the union, which should justify the SNP holding a second referendum. Also, should I say the Scottish government, because it was also the Scottish Greens as well. So this is a justification of holding a second referendum. But the Conservative Party and government disagrees with that. Liz Truss and Boris Johnson before disagree with that. So they are refusing to grant what's called a Section 30. So now the Scottish Parliament has taken this issue to the UK Supreme Court, and they are testing the question of whether or not legally the Scottish Parliament should be allowed to can be allowed to hold an independence referendum without the permission of the UK Parliament. And essentially the argument is, so the UK government is arguing that the Scottish government doesn't have the power to hold a referendum because the constitutional issues related between England and Scotland are what's called a reserved matter, which means it's a matter for the UK Parliament, and therefore the Scottish government doesn't have the power to do it alone. However, the SNP and the Scottish government are arguing that, in fact, because any referendum would be advisory, and that's a technical term, which effectively means any referendum held in this country doesn't automatically go into law. It has to then be interpreted by politicians and then put into law through politicians. Because of the fact it's advisory, and therefore if Scotland voted yes in this referendum, it wouldn't directly cause Scotland to leave the UK, if that makes sense. This therefore wouldn't directly relate to a constitutional matter, so therefore it isn't a reserved matter. And that is slightly it's a very slightly complex and legal jargon. And to be honest, I have absolutely no idea whether or not the Supreme Court will say yes or no, because I'm not a lawyer, but I guess it's just a case of we'll have to wait and see on the issue. So Katie, what are your thoughts on that?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, and there's a lot of legal jargon here. But I think that in reality, I think that there's a major flaw in their argument in that they're saying that it's an advisory referendum, because that would imply that even if yes won, that it may not happen, which we know is not going to happen. You know what I mean? Like, if yes won, the SNP aren't going to be like, oh, well, we had that referendum, it was only advisory. You know what I mean? Like, it is going to happen. Like, so that's one thing. But the second thing is I can see both sides of the argument. I think obviously we just have to let the Supreme Court decide. I think it's really important having this visibility on the Supreme Court and the importance of the Supreme Court in the UK. I think that not a lot of people understand that we too have a Supreme Court. It's very different to the American one, thank God. And you know, it does lead to often many politically contentious subjects getting a legal grounding and it being fair, right? And I think that's the most important thing. So obviously I don't want Scotland to leave the Union. I never have done. I understand why Scottish people might want to leave the Union, totally get that. But I think that putting it to the Supreme Court gives it a certain fairness and enables both sides to give their arguments and for there to be sort of an impartial decision made based on the laws of the country and our constitution, really. So yeah, I think it's fair. I have faith in the Supreme Court. They're the ones that stopped the planes to Rwanda not long ago, so I have faith that they will make the right decision. Am I worried if there's another referendum? Absolutely. I think that we need to be very careful how we tread. I think that no Conservative should be allowed in the campaign at all. But you know, that's just me as a political mind. But yeah, I can see their argument because there has been a significant change in the United Kingdom and the way that we do politics since we left Europe. So yeah, I get it.
I think, yeah. So I guess two questions coming from that. I first of all want to talk about in principle. So let's say if you were, if you were advising Keir Starmer, what would your policy be towards a second? Would you say let Scotland have a second independence referendum? Would you say Labour should grant Scotland a Section 30, or would you be opposed to that if you were, writing Labour policy right now?
It's a very difficult question. I like social policy and not this sort of policy. Anyway, I would grant them a Section 30. Because I think if they would like to have a referendum, then they should. And I think that we should shove as much as we can into discussions of the union. The only issue that I can see now is, obviously that was if we would have a Labour government. Right now, I can see why the Conservatives are hesitant to give them a Section 30, because Liz Truss hasn't even blinking spoke to Nicola Sturgeon since she came into power. They're making that relationship worse. So I can see why they don't want to give them a Section 30, because all of the mistreatment that they've been doing is going to come to light and we could have a really bad result there. So for me, if it was a Labour government, and I know that we would be trying to work with devolved powers as much as we possibly can. I mean, hell, we're the ones that devolved the powers, and said that there needs to be these devolved governments. I think that if it was under a Labour Party policy, it would be very different, because Labour views the devolved powers as very different to what the Conservatives do. The Conservatives have always preferred home rule, and they've been very hostile to any devolved power, since the 70s, for goodness sake. So, yeah, so I as a Labourite, I would give them the Section 30. As a Tory, I understand why they're not doing it, because all of their terrible behaviour is going to come back to bite them.
Yeah, I agree. I understand what you're saying. I think so. I'm quite torn on this issue. Personally, I would make the argument that as a Democrat, at the last election, the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Green Party both had in their policy a clear commitment to hold a referendum on independence. They now form a majority in the Scottish Parliament. For me, as a Democrat, I would argue, therefore, they have the legitimacy then to hold. Yeah, they have the mandate to hold a referendum. I think that's legitimate. I think that's fair. But then again, if I was, so this is the thing, right? Personally, I would let them have a referendum. I'd also, back to our conversation on Quebec last week, I would make sure you fight like crazy to win it. And obviously there's no guarantee you'll win it, but you fight like crazy. And if you do win it, I think that would probably kill the issue. Or at least I hope that would kill the issue. Because I can't see the SNP coming back after losing 2 referenda and saying, let's have a third. I just don't think that would be electorally palatable. My other point was, interestingly though, if I was advising a Davey on Lib Dem policy, I would probably say they shouldn't have a commitment to it in the Lib Dem manifesto, because in Scotland, the way you win seats in Scotland as the Lib Dems is to basically to appeal to unionist voters who are more socially or economically centrist, aren't as right wing, and might be currently very annoyed with the current Conservative Party. So strategically, and I hate to say this, is something very Machiavellian and sort of evil, and not believing in principle, but whatever gets the party away. Yeah, I'm going full ass to Campbell here. I think that there is a logic in the Lib Dems holding an anti-independence position, a strong one, because you want to attract those unionist voters in Scotland. But yeah, so I'm very much torn between my personal moral compass and what I think is strategically right for the Liberal Democrats in Scotland.
It makes sense for the Labour voters to go after the SNP voters because
absolutely,
very
absolutely,
similar.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think from Labour's perspective, I think it actually does make some sense to hold a softer position in Scotland, because that means that, because obviously lots of people who vote the SNP previously voted Labour, lots of people from working class communities, particularly in cities like Glasgow, switched from Labour to the SNP. So that makes sense. Though, of course,
and Mark Drakeford is doing so well with that position in Wales. You know,
yes.
We had a Plaid insurgency, a few years ago, and Welsh Labour is in control of Wales again.
You're jumping ahead of the gun. We'll get to Plaid later.
I was going to say, but Mark Drake. So taking that position in Scotland would be beneficial to Labour because it's worked in Wales.
Like the one possible issue would be, of course, you can guarantee the English nationalist Tory line would be they're soft on the SNP. That would be I'm just, obviously that is just to think about. That is obviously going to be the line from the Tories. So I think one more point I want to make on the SNP is, of course, if the Supreme Court does declare that Scotland doesn't have the power to hold an independence referendum on its own, the SNP's current position is that they would then use the next general election as a de facto referendum. And effectively what that would mean is, from what I gather, that it's not been made very clear, and I think that's quite intentional at the moment. From what I gather, that would mean that if a majority of people in Scotland at the next general election voted for the SNP, the Greens, or another pro-independence party, like the Alba Party or the Socialist Party or whatever, then Scotland would have a right to unilaterally declare independence. Now, that's just my interpretation. Again, it's very, very unclear about how they actually intend to do this. But to me, that just seems like a no-go. That just seems like a no. First of all, let's hypothetically say they did that. There's questions about who would recognise it internationally. I suspect nobody. There's questions, obviously, and even if they did somehow get independence, if they somehow, built some sort of Kosovan-style wall across England and Scotland and sort of declared a sort of,
rebuilt Adrian's wall.
Yeah, I mean, some sort of, Kosovan-style unrecognised nation or something. You still would never get... The whole point of the SNP's current argument is England dragged Scotland out of Europe, so we need to become independent to get back into Europe. That's their sort of... You will never get into the European Union. For example, so how the European Union works is all countries need to basically accept you as a member. Spain will never accept a de facto independent state as a member of the European Union simply because they don't want the issue of Catalonia to rise up again. Well, to continue getting worse. It's still rising. It's still there. So very clearly, I just don't see it as a no-go. I just don't see it as a starter. I think it's something that I feel like Nicola Sturgeon has had to say because she has to have a plan B. But I think practically, legally, I don't think it makes much sense. I'm not a legal expert. From what I've seen, it makes no sense. And practically, I just can't see it working. What you think?
Neither can I. And I think that one of the things that people need to remember is that legal recognition by countries throughout the world is a formal process that requires a democratic process of people to obviously vote on whether they recognise you as a country. And Britain has the United Kingdom, as it is now, has a massive, impact in international relations. We have a Security Council seat at the UN. We have, a big stake in the General Assembly in the UN as well. We have, allies world over that would feel very uncomfortable and would not back the recognition of Scotland as a country if they seceded in that way. So and exactly as you said with Spain, they would never get into the European Union with doing it like that because the Spanish would never vote for them because it's not in their interest to do that. Also, Europe has a lot of issues at the moment internally that it's dealing with. The last thing that it would need to deal with is Scotland coming in with because she's laid out so this is my main thing for the SNP, right? And I understand that the decision to leave the United Kingdom is an ideological one, okay? But there is still a grey area on how that would look, right? So how that would look in terms of industry, how it would look in terms of funding, how it would look. And the Scottish, in my opinion, would be very, very, very reliant on getting into the European Union for numerous reasons, one of which is funding, right? Because the EU, obviously, it works as everybody puts into the pot and then you get given out based on your GDP, right? And where we need to support you, etc. So Scotland, if it was to become independent, would be one of the highest, takers from the European Union. Quite rightly, I agree with that system. I think that countries that have a lower GDP should be supported. But the EU has a lot of problems at the moment. To take on a state like that, it just politically would not be in their best interests, and economically wouldn't. Like what's Scotland going to do for currency? Sign up to the euro? Well, that's not doing very well at the moment. There's a lot of things in practice. Ideologically, I understand, but in practice, I can't see it happening. And giving any positive benefit to people that live there. I think particularly used if they did it in that way, particularly, I agree. I think because it would be so bump.
Yeah, it would. I think it would be quite chaotic. I think the SNP are sort of over the next year. I think they're releasing white papers. Oh, well, I know they are. They're releasing different white papers or different policy areas of what Scotland will look like. And I am really curious to see, particularly if we get the Supreme Court judgment, what their policy regarding this will be, because they need to give a lot more detail.
They do, and they need to prepare for a massive economic shock, because, like you said, if it's just straight down, done, no, complete severance, that's going to be a massive economic shock.
Yeah, which is why again I think I am curious, because I do think Nicola Sturgeon was very uncomfortable about making this her sort of secondary plan B. I just think it was a case of there's no other option. We have to do this. Something. Yeah. So obviously, clearly though, this is all with the with the obvious point that if the Supreme Court says actually Scotland can hold an independence referendum, then this all then becomes hypothetical and doesn't matter. I
think that's the best way forward, to be honest with you. I think that will be the least incendiary way forward.
I think so, but obviously, we can't prejudge the court, because again, we're not legal experts, and who knows what they'll do. We're political scientists, not bloody lawyers. So, so that's all we can do is wait and see on that issue. So, moving swiftly on to a party which I'm sure many of our viewers probably won't have heard of, Reform UK, which as of 2 years ago was called the Brexit Party, which was sort of a Nigel Farage's breakaway party from UKIP. Those ones. So it's these guys. And the reason why I bring them up, because people might go, well, we've had Brexit, what's the point of even talking about them? Which I think is a valid question. Firstly, looking at polls, they are consistently holding about 3 to 5% in the polls, which obviously in a first past the post system doesn't mean much. They obviously wouldn't win any seats from that, unless they really, really targeted one seat and just went absolutely crazy on it. And even then, I'm sort of skeptical. But yeah, so I think it is important. I think particularly as we hit uncertain economic times, there's always a risk that a party like this. And I think I was listening to Richard Tice, who is the leader of the Reform UK. I was listening to his conference speech yesterday because I wanted to try and basically I wanted to understand what they're talking about now, right? Because Brexit's done. What are they campaigning on?
What's the point of you?
Yeah, well, exactly. So it was very much a case of we want to reform a broken political system and we want to, help you economically. And it's very much this. It is very much a right-wing populist narrative, right? It's very much, and the reason why I want to bring this up is because obviously a lot of people forget when UKIP first emerged. It wasn't because of Europe. In 2010, 2011, people weren't sort of shouting and screaming about wanting to leave the European Union. I would argue that the emergence of UKIP came more because of, first of all, lots of annoyed people in the Tory party who were annoyed with Cameron's more centrist politics or trying to technically socially more centrist politics. And also, I think a lot of, particularly in sort of working class communities, there was a sort of growing support amongst people who felt economically, left out, felt that they hadn't benefited from globalization, hadn't benefited from the economic system. So I would point out that there are some repeating themes coming up. So the economy doesn't look like it's in a particularly good place. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong, but it feels like we're going into very uncertain economic times. And I suspect once that happens, there'll be a lot of people in the Tory party and lots of former Tory supporters who will be very upset and angry about that. So I am just raising the possibility that could we see this party go sort of, possibly from 5 to sort of 10% in the polls. I would argue that is a possibility in certain circumstances, and therefore it should be discussed. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with that. I do think that one of the main issues with UKIP was very much, similar to the right-wing populism of Donald Trump, is people thought it was funny when it first came around. A lot of people in tweed jackets talking about the good old days. Everybody was like, yeah, okay, whatever. But obviously it resonated with a lot of people. I think that Reform UK occupies a part of the political spectrum which is often overlooked. So in the UK, we seem to have like the centre, which is like the Liberal Democrats, right? Then the left is Labour and the Greens, and the right was just the Tories. So Reform UK is taking up the space that UKIP took up, which is right of the Tories, whereas the Greens are left of Labour. And I think it's really important to look at this from a representative democracy type situation, in that to a lot of people in the UK, like you said, even if it's like 3-5% of the vote nationally, that's still a lot of people. That represents something that they stand for. And this right-wing populism, what it does is it enables them to kind of have these very right-wing views that the Conservatives now really have shifted to hold, because the Conservatives have shifted further right. But it arguably makes Reform UK more dangerous, because if they don't fit into the Tory party now, their populism is going to be a hell of a lot more strange. So, I think it's an important conversation to have. And I think one of the things that people that are members of the three major parties, let's say, have a tendency to do is rubbish the smaller parties and say that they don't matter. And I think that's obviously why UKIP and the Brexit referendum happened, is because we were too busy rubbishing them, saying, oh, well, they're just little parties, they'll just get on with it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think particularly we saw that during COVID. I think Reform UK became the sort of the biggest anti-lockdown party. So I think we will see.
And we all saw protests, anti-mask protesters and stuff, and that was all from these guys.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so just to give you an idea more of their broader policy platform, I did go on their website. They're opposed to the House of Lords, which again I believe is kind of what I would say is I think this comes from the tradition of more radical right-wing populism, which is anti-elitist, right? So they see the House of Lords as a bunch of stuffy political establishment figures, which is probably actually quite accurate if you think about it. And obviously that their view is we should get rid of them.
New money argument, love it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's this idea, they're a bunch of stuffy. And also I think we should point out the fact, of course, there is a Lib Dem Labour majority in the House of Lords as well, which probably means that the right absolutely detests it. Ironically, the more radical part of the right probably hates it for that as well. They're unsurprisingly, they're anti-BBC as well. They're very skeptical and critical of the BBC, as are most radical left and radical right-wing parties. They support electoral reform as well, which again I think the way they frame it is very much our political system is broken, so we need to, they're called Reform UK, right? It's about reforming. So it's very much this idea that the political system is broken, let's shake it up. And that's that's a very common populist right-wing position amongst definitely amongst European parties and on the far right. It's definitely very common.
That was Farage's whole bit, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he is actually, I think Farage is still technically ceremonial president of the party. But Richard Tice is the leader. I think that is the one point I would make. Richard Tice, to me, with Nigel Farage, you had someone who was charismatic, as much as I disliked him. He was charismatic. He could, have a pint in a pub and everyone would laugh and find him funny. Richard Tice doesn't give me that impression. Whenever I see him, he always comes across as very much, a bit of a posh Tory who just joined UKIP, then the Brexit Party, because he was too right-wing for them.
Maybe that's something we can look at with Reform UK and saying that the political system's broken. So what? So we're getting rid of the House of Lords because it's full of elites. And who runs Reform UK again? I don't. Huh?
Well, yeah. I mean, there was always that hypocrisy of Nigel Farage, saying he was opposed to the elites, while quite literally suckling on the teat of Europe, getting all the European money. But yeah, well, it's one of these things. Yeah, and I thought we should bring it up. I think also I would always emphasize the fact that one of the big successes of UKIP was never winning seats. I think they won, at the height of their power, they had 2 seats from by-elections, and then they didn't win a single seat when they got their most votes in 2015.
It was all about Clacton.
Yes,
it was all about Clacton.
It was Clacton. There was another, I can't remember what the other one was. But the point I make is that it's very much because of our political system, our electoral system, the threat of a party like this isn't in hard power, it's more in soft power. So what the fear is, if Reform UK did, let's say, hit sort of 10% in the polls, there would suddenly be a huge pressure from the right of the Tory party on Liz Truss to say, oh my God, we're going to lose a bunch of seats to Labour because half our vote's going to hemorrhage to Reform UK. We need to move to the right. which is arguably what happened to Cameron, and his fear of UKIP is arguably what pushed him to hold a EU referendum. So yeah, so I think is always a fear. Which, well, I'm not saying it'll definitely happen. I'm just saying it's something you should always be aware of, and it's always a risk that could come up again. I think is my main point.
It's a narrative. So whenever these parties start gaining considerable vote share across the nation, it doesn't have to be concentrated to create seats. What happens is obviously. It's one of my main, so it's like, you said that people from the left and the right criticise the BBC. It's one of my main criticisms of the BBC, right, is because they feel the need to represent everybody in the British political system. Like Nigel Farage was overly represented in the BBC because they were like, no, we should have him because, they vote share and all of this stuff. And this is the thing. It enables these parties to start gaining control of the narrative. And that's when it becomes dangerous, is when they start gaining control of the narrative around like UKIP, like with immigration, with certain aspects of the economy, when it comes to benefits, etc. When these parties start gaining control of the narrative in that way, like you said, it can force the Tories further right because they feel like they've lost control of the narrative on their side of the spectrum.
Yeah, so I think I would push back on that slightly because I think I'm always quite torn on this, right? So I understand the argument, people are critical of the BBC for allowing people like Farage on and giving them a platform. But then again, the BBC does have to represent everyone, right? I think my main point would be, first of all, I do think they gave him too much of a platform. Like he was on Question Time every other week, it felt like. Secondly, I would also argue I would argue the BBC has always felt more comfortable giving platforms to radical right than they have the radical left. And I don't particularly like either of them, but I do think that's an observation that I think is a slight concern. But
so my argument isn't that they gave him airtime, okay? My argument is that for the proportion of the vote that he controlled in the United Kingdom, they gave him too much airtime. So for me, he was on far more regularly than the Greens, than the Liberal Democrats, who actually held seats in Parliament. He was far, far more represented than they were. So for me, it's this notion of impartiality that the BBC has, where if it's raining outside, we have to have a person on that says that it's raining and a person on that says that it isn't. That's not impartiality. It should be represented based on what you have, right? The facts.
Yeah.
And he was on Question Time like constantly because
I understand.
Getting viewing for them, so we know why they did it.
Yeah.
It's not. But to me, that was why it was. So that's why I'm very skeptical of these parties, because it's very easy for them to get on because they get viewers, but also they drum up controversy, which again gets viewers and gets people talking about the shows. But it is not, in fact, representative of British democracy when they keep wheeling out these populist right-wing figures. They should have Liberal Democrats on there, SNP on there, Greens, because they are elected and people do vote for them throughout the country as well. So.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I guess I'm always try to be more defensive of the BBC because I think it does get a lot of attacks from both sides. Absolutely. I do like to defend the BBC because I think they do get a very tough time from everyone, and I think it's obviously a very difficult thing to run. If you're being criticised by the left and the right, you're probably doing something wrong. Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to the Green Party because I do want to talk about them. So they're currently. I don't mean to offend them, but I do think it's important to clarify they are led by. There are two leaders of the Green Party. They're sort of co-led by Carla Denyer and Adrian Ramsey, and I think so. This is the interesting thing, right? I don't think they're particularly well known, either of them. They're both former councillors. I don't think they ever have elected office, but the Greens are doing quite well in polling. They are sort of at about 5 to 7% in the polls, sort of on the heels of the Lib Dems quite a lot of the time in these polls. So it's interesting that despite the fact they don't get much media attention, their leadership isn't that well known. I think I can almost guarantee if you ask most people who the leader of the Green Party is, they'd say Caroline Lucas, who was their sole MP, even though she's not.
I got it wrong. I just want to put that out there. I got it wrong. I thought she was one, because I know it needs to be two people.
Yeah.
I thought she was one half of it. So
but it is interesting. I think so. The reason why it is interesting. So they are doing quite well in the polls. I also think they are slightly buoyed by the fact there has been Green success elsewhere in Europe and in the UK. So in Germany, the Green Party is now one of the parties of government, along with the SDP and the Liberal Party in Germany. And in Scotland, of course, the Scottish Green Party is now in a coalition government with the SNP. So there is a sort of, you get the impression the Greens do feel like, there is a moment here, there is a time, and they are doing very well as well in local elections. They've gained a lot of council seats in local elections. They do seem to be very effective at local campaigning, as I'm sure you know in Norwich very well. So yeah, so I'm interested. What are your thoughts on the Greens and their prospects for the next couple of years?
That's an interesting thing to ask me. Norwich South is one of their targets. And it has been for a while. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really important political moment for the Green Party. I think that obviously as we're having, worldwide climate discussions and we need action on climate now, it is really, really important that they're getting their voices out there and that the Green Party is gaining a lot of support. And actually, it's from what I'm seeing from polls and stuff, it's from young people and also actually from older people as well. People that want to obviously see wildlife areas preserved, no more river dumping of sewage, etc. So that's great. I think that their policies. I'm trying not to be Labour biased now, because obviously the Greens are one of Labour's biggest opponents, right? Because they're coming at us from the left. So I would say that I think that what I want to see from the Greens is I want to see more astute and economically minded policies. I think a lot of their policies are very socially minded. I think a lot of their policies are very progressive when it comes to climate, etc. But one of the things that I would really like to see from them is a bit more focus on economic issues. So I remember not so long ago, there was a Green councillor, I believe it was in Brighton, that said, you should only eat organic food. Anybody that doesn't eat organic food is, this, that, and the other. And so what we need to see from the Greens is that sort of recognition and movement from that sort of middle-class eco-warrior type image into a more rounded image, I would say, because one of the issues that I find that they have issue with is they do very well in Norwich South, is a really good example, in quite middle-class seats. Which is great, and that's fine, but I think that their message and the politics that they're trying to preach would actually affect a lot of change and positive change for working class people. So I think that that's one of the areas that I'd like to see them work on, because I think that would give them a bit more oomph in the polls for me, because speaking from somebody from a working class background, like the Greens don't do very well where I'm from in the industrial Midlands, because people just see it. So my dad, when I asked my dad what the Greens were, my dad said that they were all yuppies, and they need to get rid of that image, I think, because some of their policies are absolutely fantastic, and I think until they shed that, they won't be able to break through that group. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree?
I think I do understand what you're saying, but I also think in a weird way, because of where they are as a party, I think obviously if you're looking to turn the Green Party into, let's say, in a crazy world, one of the big two parties, obviously you would need that, right? And we've seen that in Germany. The Greens have done
to challenge Labour.
Well, yeah. So yeah, but I think obviously the obvious example is I think the Greens in Germany, right? They've done a fantastic job of sort of turning themselves into a rounded, party on all issues. But I think bizarrely, I don't know, do the Greens in this country need to do that? I mean, I've always sort of seen them as a party that does very well at highlighting environmental issues. And, they do very well at sort of highlighting issues and sort of bringing them to the attention of people. But I don't know. Well, obviously, maybe that they'll obviously want to grow as a party. But I see them as sort of like a party that campaigns on the environment, and that's okay, right? Like, I don't think that's a big issue.
I think if they want to get seats outside of Brighton, then they have to do that. And that's just my opinion. And I would like to see them get seats outside of Brighton, because I think as I've said, proportional representation, progressive coalition girl, I would like to see them working with Labour and working with, the Liberals and stuff, and really pushing the country forward and owning that narrative and not being excluded in the same way that the Tories have excluded them. So I think it would do them good to get some more seats.
I absolutely, I agree with that. Absolutely. I think it would be extremely beneficial if we had a sort of a bigger group of Greens in the House of Commons. I think that's obviously a good example of another argument for PR, as I'm sure we both agree on. But yeah,
not trying to push that at all.
No, yeah. I think my final point would be, I think, as you say, looking ahead for them at the next general election, they've obviously had they've had a lot of successes locally, and I think that should be, I don't think that, again, I think actually I do agree with you in the sense that I think if you're looking at representation from the BBC, I think the Greens get terribly represented. I don't think they ever get a fair representation. I don't remember the last time a Green was on Question Time, for example. I think it's...
And Caroline Lucas is a fantastic speaker, so they should have her on more because she is fantastic.
Yes, I think she's very, very, very passionate. I remember she came to UEA for a People's Vote thing, and she was absolutely fantastic and brilliant and very, very friendly as well. Because obviously, she's much more left wing than I am, for example, but she was very friendly and welcoming, and had no issue, talking to people, which I think is good, obviously. But yeah, so looking ahead, do you think the Greens, because obviously every election the Greens say we're going to break that, the threshold they have is one, they're going to get more than one seat, and that's kind of every single election ever since Caroline Lucas was elected. The aim was we're going to get one more than Caroline Lucas, we're going to add more than Caroline Lucas, and every year it doesn't happen. And the crazy thing is they've had such a variety of, I think they had quite a high vote share in 2015, then it was quite low in 2017, then it peaked up again in 19, so it goes up and down, but really the one seat doesn't change. So do you think, okay, that's the question, do you think the Greens will have more than one MP come the next general election?
That's a very interesting question. 2015, just remember when they got an increased vote share, the BBC actually called that they'd won Norwich South. So that was the year that they put, yes, they did, yeah, 2015, that was that year. Because I was campaigning for Clive in Norwich South for Labour, and we were like, I'm not sure they have, because we've been on the doorstep all day. But anyway, the BBC did call it. So do I think that I think it's very much the same issue that you've got. If they target correctly, then yes. And I think what they need to do is they need to target, it sounds really weird because obviously it's the Greens, but they need to target environmentally conscious and minded cities to be able to get that vote. I don't think that they need to focus anywhere else. I think they should try and get an urban Green vote, and I think that would definitely result in them getting another seat.
Is it
where they target, because I don't want them to target Norwich South.
Well, I was going to say, I think they're two. Aren't there two big targets? Norwich and Bristol. I believe they're their two sort of
Norwich
big.
And Bristol. So go for Bristol.
Yeah, fair enough.
I honestly think if they try and turn out the vote in urban areas, environmentally minded urban areas with prey on that student vote, that middle class vote, etc., they can get out there, and I think we could see another Green MP. I would like them to have a seat, as much as I know that everybody that I know in Labour is going to be watching me like, why are you saying that? I would like the Greens to have a bit more power.
I agree with that, though. I would give you the cautious tell they'll almost certainly take a seat off Labour if they do take it off anyone. So sorry about that. Just to give you the warning. But no, I think that's very, very mature of you to hold that view. I agree. I think it would be beneficial if we had a handful rather than just Caroline Lucas, who I think also it's sort of does win the MP of, I don't know who votes on this, but the MP of the Year award competition. I think she's won a few times, so she clearly is very well respected. She is very well respected. So moving on, I am cautious of time. So moving swiftly on to the final party of our talk today is Plaid Cymru. And just for those who don't know, I always feel a bit patronising when I say stuff like this, but I always want to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? So Plaid Cymru is effectively the Welsh equivalent of the SNP. They are in favour of Welsh independence. They're the Welsh Nationalist Party. And so interestingly, just because they haven't actually had their conference yet, it's in a couple of weeks' time. I think it's on the 21st, 22nd of October, I think. And so Plaid are in a bit of a strange place. They so right at the start of COVID, I feel like this is a good place to start. There was not a huge, but there was a certain bubbling of support for Welsh independence. It went from about sort of 15% to about a third. Suddenly there felt like there was this sort of something. It felt like something was happening, and I suspect this was partly because of how horribly Boris Johnson had done in COVID, particularly early on, compared to Mark Drakeford, who came across much more positive. Sorry, Mark Drakeford, who's the First Minister of Wales, came across much more positively.
Labour politician.
Yes, the Labour First Minister, I should emphasise. So I think that did see a little bit of a boost in support for independence. And that meant that going into, in 2021, similar to Scotland, Wales had assembly elections for what's called the Welsh Senedd or the Welsh Parliament. And Plaid Cymru put independence right at the forefront. It was very much, if we get a Plaid majority, we will campaign, we will have an independence referendum. I believe it was within 2 terms, I think it was. I don't think it was within the immediate term. I think it was 2 terms. But yeah, it was very much a case of we are putting independence at the forefront. And it didn't really work. It seemed what happened was that they didn't lose support. It just went sideways. I think their vote share dropped by 0.2% on both the list and the constituency vote, and I think they gained a single seat. So it seems they have got, and a similar thing happened in the council elections. I think they lost, I think they had 208 before, and they have 202 now local seats in Wales. So it's very much the last couple of years has been a sort of stagnation effect. And interestingly, I suspect part of the reason for that is it does seem that even though there is more support for independence in Wales, a lot of these people still vote Labour, or at least a significant minority of these people still vote Labour, which I find fascinating with my own sort of research hat on. And yeah, so I'm just curious, where do you think? Oh, also, sorry, I should also note that as of the 2021 election, the Welsh Labour Party isn't in government with Plaid Cymru, but they have signed an agreement, a confidence and supply agreement. So just to be clear, it's not a coalition government, but it is a sort of agreement where Plaid works with Labour on constitutional issues, on social issues, and on a variety of other things as well. So yeah, Katie, what are your thoughts on Plaid Cymru and where they could go in the future?
I think it's fascinating with Wales. I think that with Wales, what you've got is you've got a certain amount. I think that there's a large amount of identity politics that goes on in Wales. In that, obviously, Wales is former massive mining communities in Wales, huge trade unionism movement. The Welsh are very proud socialists, right? So, you're talking about Nicola Sturgeon saying that she thinks the Tories are vile. You wait till you talk to Welsh people, So there's this tradition there, right, which I think is one of the reasons why the Labour voters withheld so strong. Now, this is an opportunity for Plaid in as much as it's a downfall for Labour, right? And I was listening to Mark Drakeford talk about this the other day, and he basically said he doesn't want people to vote Labour because their granddad voted Labour and their dad votes Labour and their aunt's cat whatever votes. You know what I mean? Like, there's got to be a reason why people vote for you. And Plaid has this benefit now, I think, if they turn away from solely being focused on independence, which I think the indication of the signing of the agreement shows, because Mark Drakeford and Welsh Labour are pro-union, they are not for Welsh independence. I think the signing of this enables Plaid to focus on more rounded policy areas. And I think that that's really important, because I think that where Labour is struggling at the moment, even though Labour's winning, is it's struggling to tear away from that identity politics and actually form itself as a party that people vote for on issues and vote for because of their controlling of things. Whereas Plaid have the benefit of being able to, come out with these issue-based policies and attack that. So what I'd like to see from Plaid now is more of a rounded approach, stepping away from independence and forming themselves as a more kind of all-rounded party. I think that would really enable them to stand up against Welsh Labour. Not that I would like them to, but I think that that's where they would need to go, because I see that as a weakness for us. What's your?
I think I understand what you're saying. I think, to give Adam Price some credit, I think Plaid has done that in the past. I remember in 2019, Adam Price, during the leaders' debates, gave a really, really important intervention on mental health, where he talked about his own mental health.
Really good as well.
Yeah, they do talk about other stuff. I suspect Plaid fell into the trap where they saw those polls in 2020 where independence was increasing, and they thought, oh my god, we can jump on this. This is our time.
And they got cheesed off because the Tories were handling everything crap and people were dying.
Yeah, I understand why they chose that moment. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, it looks like it wasn't the right thing to do. But I would also point out, Plaid Cymru does have more of a challenge on its hands compared to the SNP, in the sense that Welsh Labour really does embrace Welsh patriotism. I mean, I spoke to plug previous videos on this YouTube channel. I spoke to Carwyn Jones just over a year ago now, and one of the things we spoke about was this idea that in Welsh Labour, they embrace patriotism. There's this real strong, we are Labour, we are socialist, we are Welsh, and it's this proud sort of patriotism, which means that those soft Welsh sort of nationalist voters, those sort of proud Welsh people who would maybe consider independence, don't feel like they need to go to a pro-independence party because they have Welsh Labour. And Welsh Labour offers things on language, it offers more powers to the Welsh Senedd, it offers these things which actually, if you want to compare it to Scotland, I think was one of Scottish Labour's biggest mistakes.
But yeah,
they didn't embrace Scottish patriotism in the way that the Welsh Labour Party has embraced Welsh national or patriotism. I always like to call it patriotism, not nationalism, because I think there's a slight difference. But yeah, but yeah, so I think that is a difficulty for Plaid, and again, I think that leads into your point. I agree, they really should focus on a broader platform.
Because I think, like we said, all of this leads back to my comment on identity politics, right? Like the Welsh identity, it forms such an important part of how they vote, right? And, you know, I didn't want to bang my own drum when I was first, but Welsh Labour are doing a really, really good job of making sure that there's this patriotism which is funneling into Welsh programmes, etc. You know, they've made sure that they've got the free prescriptions, etc. And so Welsh people do feel generally happy with the Labour government. Now, this is where, again, as you said, this is where Labour fell down in Scotland and why it's so difficult for Labour to get back in Scotland, because they didn't have that, and why the SNP has such a strong hold. And I think that Plaid has a lot more work to do than the SNP, but I still think that there's a position for Plaid, and I think that they shouldn't be written off as a considerable party in the United Kingdom. They are a considerable party. They do a lot of good. They were fantastic over COVID with their lines and everything. They supported Mark Drakeford, and there was a really good coalition sort of mentality out there where they were working together, and I really liked it. It's nice to see.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree with that. I think my final point would be, as I agree with what you say. I think Plaid is a significant party, has always been a significant party, particularly after the evolutionary helped them sort of gain a foothold in Wales. But I think what I would point out is, so support for independence is approximately, I believe, 25 to 30% in Wales, which doesn't seem like a lot. But if you look back at Scotland in sort of 2005, 2006, it was a similar sort of level in Scotland. So I would just say, well, I don't think Wales will become an independent country anytime soon. It's something similar to, I guess you could say, Reform UK. Don't take your eye off it. Don't get cocky, because very quickly, if the Labour Party makes a mistake or makes an error, Plaid could jump on it, and then very quickly these things can change. If Plaid gets a bigger foothold and they start to push independence again, you can suddenly see support for it increase quite quickly, as we did in Scotland. So while I think the Labour Party has done really well to sort of limit Plaid's ability to succeed, particularly in that debate, I do think we have seen we have seen independent support increase, particularly amongst young people. There seems to be much more support amongst young people. So yeah, so don't take your eye off the ball would be my lesson to unionists in Wales.
One of the things that I want to say, I was going to say when Labour gets into power, but I'm tempting fate there. If Labour wins the next general election, one of the things that I would like to see is I would like to see an increased focus on the devolved parties and the importance of elevating those voices again. I think it's one thing that Tony Blair did incredibly well, and I think that it's something that needs to happen again. Labour needs to focus on the devolved powers and to make sure that they have funding and make sure that their thoughts are heard throughout Westminster. So Westminster's not just English centric.
I would say, I was going to say, what about the evolution in England? But to be honest, we've had our hour. We do not have time to talk about the very complex issue that is a minefield. The constitutional issues in England are just, would take another hour probably. So thank you so much for listening. As always, we really appreciate it. What sort of things are you keeping an eye on, Katie, over the next couple of weeks? Is anything catching your eye?
Keeping an eye on the midterms for Joe.
Did you watch the BBC documentary a week ago about the possible return of Trump? Did you watch it?
On my list, I couldn't.
It's very good. I really enjoyed it. I mean, there's some absolute nutters on there.
Yeah, I just finished the 3-parter about Bolsonaro, and I was like,
what did you think?
I need a break.
But it was a really interesting documentary, right? If you're interested in politics, definitely watch that.
I would recommend it.
It was called The Bolsonaro, wasn't it? The Bolsonaro Boys from Brazil.
Yeah, Bolsonaro Boys of Brazil.
It's fascinating, terrifying, but fascinating. I mean, really worth a watch.
So scary.
One thing I did find from the documentary, they looked at Pennsylvania and the Senate race in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And I love the Democratic candidate. He's just this really cool guy, he just comes across as such a sort of, the perfect candidate for Pennsylvania for the Democrats. It just seems just brilliant. Yeah,
I love him.
He's great. Yeah, and he's going up against the Republican candidate? It's a guy called Dr. Oz. He's some weird.
The telly.
Yeah, he's some weird right wing doctor. What's the? Because you don't get them in the UK. What is it called? Like a celebrity doctor, isn't it? I guess. Yeah.
So he's like Dr. Phil, who's not actually a doctor.
Yeah, it's very that feels like a very American,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Anyway.
So
keep an eye on obviously midterms, but the second round of the Brazil elections are on the 30th of October as well. and the Tory party is still tearing itself apart, and now Truss is going on. Truss is going on the charm offensive apparently, which usually happens after. This is something which usually happens after about 8-9 years of a government when they're trying to rebuild bridges that have been broken. This is happening after a month, so it really shows you how well that's going.
On the charm offensive, apart from the public, who she's pushing Theresa Coffey in front of, who everyone likes.
Oh my god! Did you watch her?
So
did you watch her interview? Did you watch her interview on LBC yesterday?
Yes, it was
with smoking.
Awful.
Oh, it's
Why
mad.
As the health secretary, did you vote to allow smoking in cars with children in? I just thought that maybe it was.
But it's the fact she said. The fact that she said at the time she said, "Oh, I thought it was right to do at the time, but I can't actually remember if the law's been changed." You're the health secretary. You should know that. That's definitely under your. But anyway, yeah. So the point is, there's definitely still lots to look out for, and I'm sure next week we'll bring you all the latest of what's happening.
Absolutely. And when the midterms come round, we will have a midterm episode. We'll talk about.
They're on a Tuesday, right? And obviously, then we obviously do episodes on a Wednesday, so I think that's pretty perfect.
If I sleep, because
it might be a very late episode, just to let Katie recover from the night before.
I'll be watching John King on CNN with his map.
Anyway, so as always, thank you so much for listening. Obviously, if you can, like, share, subscribe, all that jazz, we really appreciate it. All right, thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks.